My name's Tim Winkler. I'm from Future Campus and welcome to Changing Tracks, Critical Ingredients for Better Tertiary Pathways. Webinar brought to you in collaboration with my equals, and it's going to be a good one. Before we go any further, I am delighted to acknowledge we're living and working on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land, and would like to pay my respect to Indigenous elders and people, past, present and emerging, and also recognise the value of Indigenous knowledge and culture, which is really important and increasingly recognised as of tremendous value to our lives as Australians. Now, this is a fascinating topic, and for this webinar, we have a fascinating cast. Professor Barney Glover, who still wears multiple caps as Interim Chief Commissioner of ATEC, as well as Jobs and Skills Australia Commissioner, and no doubt other things besides. Jenny Dodd, the face of TAFE for many people, CEO of TAFE Directors Australia, and Professor Romy Lawson, Senior Deputy Vice Chancellor of Flinders University. Welcome to all of you.
Great to meet you.
Last but not least, I also want to welcome Anthony Manahan from My Equals, who has got a really interesting introduction for us to take us through the outline of where we're going with the conversation today, and then we'll lead us off. So, Anthony, over to you.
Thanks very much, Tim. So I'm just bringing up. What would a webinar be without at least a short PowerPoint presentation? It is very short, just to provide a little bit of context. And look, so just wanting to sort of reflect very briefly on the history of My Equals and the connection to collaboration that's been at the heart of it from the start. So it came out of the Groningen Declaration, which is an international convention that promotes, in effect, around student mobility and secure digital credentials. And as a result of that connection through the heads of student administration, the sector, as in this point, the higher education, the university sector, collectively from a grassroots perspective, said we need to do something to support our students better and to deliver a number of other benefits. And so there was the Universities of Australia and Universities of New Zealand both became signatories to the Groningen Declaration Network. The HES, which is Higher Ed Services, is owned by Universities of Australia and is a not-for-profit organisation, was then appointed as a managing organisation for My Equals in partnership with Digitary, as they were at the time, who's now Instructure, who's the technology partner, which then resulted in My Equals, which is the, if you like, the accepted, and I'm going to go inverted commas, but official platform for issuing of tertiary credentials from Australia and New Zealand universities and many other organisations now. I'd alluded to, out of that initial collaboration, what were the drivers, and the primary ones were around student mobility, the student experience, credential integrity, and operational efficiency. And they all remain relevant today, but in particular, I think around the student mobility and experience and the integrity of the credentials. And so we're going to sort of touch on a number of these during the conversation. Just a very quick snapshot that beyond the original 47 universities, we now have 131 providers, and where My Equals is recognised as a trusted source over 135 countries, 3.8 million learner accounts, and over 14 million academic records shared now across the platform, which is amazing. It's a very quick snapshot of some of the participants involved, and again across the universities, TAFE, and private providers across Australia and New Zealand. One of the other collaborative initiatives that's falling under this broad ethos, which some of you may have heard about, is the Australia and New Zealand Credit Management Initiative, which is looking again to take that collective and collaborative and sector-driven approach to support our students, and ourselves as a sector in support of credit. And this is, particularly important in that context of tertiary harmonisation, the ability to have those omnidirectional pathways and porous pathways between higher ed and VEC and those and those different institutions. And so I think this is another example of the potential power of collaboration. And so I think, going into the discussion, I think my equals that collaborative ethos is, it's a critical ingredient for better tertiary pathways. So I think I might then, that's the intro, if you like, over. And I might sort of throw to Barney first to say, of those sort of those original drivers, and particularly in the current landscape, what do you think? I mean, how are they still resonating? How do you think they're still valid? And what else do we need to do?
Thanks, Anthony, and thanks for the introduction. And first of all, congratulations around MyEquals for everyone who's been involved in it. When you saw that slide with all of the participants, all of the institutions that are part of this family that is MyEquals, it is incredibly impressive. It's a great Australian initiative with a now international reach, and I think something that we can be very, very proud of. And it emphasises what that original declaration was emphasising very strongly. That is, let's have open student mobility. Let's have it at a global level, absolutely, but let's make sure that we can achieve it within our own jurisdictions. And the other important part of this, I think, is we're talking tertiary, not particularly higher education or universities, although it has a very significant primary focus there, but it's a broader concept for MyEquals, and it's a broader opportunity to consider the tertiary system implications of platforms like MyEquals in the sort of current zeitgeist. And part of that zeitgeist is around tertiary harmonisation, something that Jenny and I have been talking about for a long time. Some would say decades in the making, to try and join up our tertiary education system more effectively. I won't steal Jenny's thunder, but there are some things I might say that I've had honed into me by Jenny's very powerful advocacy for TAFE and for block credit arrangements and other things that have really been holding us back as a nation in many ways. We've got great tertiary education sectors in vet and higher ed. The system, we believe, we being both Jobs and Skills Australia and the Interim ATEC, we believe could be much sharper and in the national interest. And when you start to unpack what that might mean, it does lead us very strongly to the sorts of capability that MyEquals reflects and the opportunities that provides a collaborative platform to manage, for example, credit recognition, which you mentioned in the slide pack around the Australian-New Zealand credit management system in that regard. So first of all, a little bit of background. Jobs and Skills Australia delivered a report on tertiary harmonisation at the beginning of last year, before the federal election, but a very important moment to say to the two ministers at the time, Andrew Giles and Jason Clare, that we believe there is a major reform agenda where the momentum is building to bring it about, coming out of all of the work that's gone on around qualifications reform and around a national skills agreement for Australia, but also around the Universities Accord and its recommendations. That big reform agenda coming together with the potential for a second term for the Albanese government. What was that going to mean about this next wave of reform? And in our view, tertiary harmonisation was going to be a key part of that. It was also going to be a key part of it because it is the nature of where we are as a nation now and our aspirations over the next 25 years to uplift the qualifications, the attainment levels of our working age population to 80% by 2050. That's a big aspirational target for Australia. But it means we have to uplift many people from an equity background and who've had an educationally disadvantaged background to better participate in tertiary education. Over 90% of all jobs within the next 5 years are going to require tertiary qualifications. And let's not forget, not just tertiary qualifications, not just the skills associated with tertiary qualifications, but AI fluent, AI literate, AI competent graduates and those completing their qualifications. So we have a huge challenge ahead of us. So the last thing we want is to have a system which is not reflecting that opportunity for a more joined up, more cohesive, more collaborative tertiary education system. And credit management is a critical part of that, but not the only part, but it's a critically important part of it. Lots of things happening even before we have a credit recognition framework, which Minister Clare and Minister Giles have asked ATEC to deliver over the next few months. The Tertiary System Advisory Council will be meeting in April. We'll be discussing that and a range of other initiatives. But at the core of this, in a way, just to wrap up this opening comment from me, but the core of it really is that if we move to all of the aspirational characteristics we want for our tertiary education system that were espoused in the University Accord and broadly with the National Skills Agreement and elsewhere, if we really do want to achieve that, then those characteristics are system level characteristics. We have to have collaboration, cooperation, and a certain amount of courage to bring about a more joined up system. And to do that, we're going to need the systems and the platforms that will enable it to happen with, and by virtue of those sorts of platforms, to lower the barriers to people moving between vet and higher ed and vet, and more broadly into the labour market to address all of our skill needs and our occupational shortages. So I'm really excited about an opportunity to have this conversation today and hear from other panel members about what's possible. In my mind, incredibly timely. I mentioned to panel members a moment ago, I'm pretty certain that the ATEC legislation will be debated in the Senate today. I'm hopeful that's the case. I haven't checked in the last few minutes. Hopefully that's happening. I hope that legislation will pass and that we'll have the full ATEC in place in the next couple of months. If that's the case, all the more important to have these conversations about what something like My Equals and the collaborative ethos of My Equals can do around aspects of tertiary harmonisation. So really pleased to be here, very excited by the opportunity.
And if I may build on, what Barney and Anthony have said, I'll also just disclose that I'm the chair of the Steerco for My Equals. So I represent the membership, that 113, I think it is, Anthony, members that we have to try and make sure that what we're doing is actually suiting the sector. And what I want to emphasise is that the solution is the solution, and it is a good solution that My Equals has found. But would we have been able to find solutions within different institutions? Maybe yes, but the amount of effort it would have taken for us to do it individually or in small groups would have been immense. The cost would have been a lot higher. And what has really, really been special about what's happened through the My Equals project and getting to that platform is that collaboration. And I know Barney and Anthony have both said it, but I just really wanted to emphasize it because that is the secret sauce. That's the specialness about this. Where else is there a place where we've got 113 different organisations from across higher education, Australia, New Zealand, TAFE, private, that are having this really constructive conversation and working together to try and find solutions that can be effective, efficient and viable for us as a sector. So I think that that's really important. And the power of convening people together to have these conversations is really important. Barney, you talked about some of the things that are going on. There is a lot going on and it's very, very exciting and people are very excited about it, but they're also a bit scared about the enormity of it. And again, if I think we try and tackle these things TAFE by TAFE, university by university, private education provider by private education provider, we're going to struggle. And I think the way forward is to think about how do we create this kind of membership where we actually work so well together to come to a solution that has that kind of wider spread impact for us. So yeah, just both wanted just to double down on it.
And so, Jenny, I was just wondering if you wanted to reflect from, like, particularly through your lens and your experience about, where you see some of the key areas of opportunity, or and particularly maybe where some of those challenges that are still there, and what we might need to do to try to taking that collaborative approach, but to overcome them.
You're muted, Jenny.
Sorry. Thank you, Anthony, and thank you to Barney and Romy for setting off the environment. I think when TAFEs first got involved with MyEquals, you asked the question, Anthony, initially of Barney, what were the drivers, the 4 drivers that were there still there, and unquestionably it was about providing better learner experience for TAFEs to move into this digital environment, and also managing what had become significant demands for digital credentials. And in our sector in particular, who'd come out of a environment where manipulation or fraud, if you like, was not in the vocational sector unheard of by many of the players. There was a strong sense from the TAFEs, we have to protect our brand, we have to protect our credentials. And so that notion that this was a mechanism to do that was very strong at the time. But I think in quoting what Romy said, I think the collaborative ethos that has then emerged by being involved, and I want to acknowledge my colleagues in particular from TAFE SA, Penny Johnston in particular firstly, and now Victoria Griffith, who've taken the leadership as representing the TAFE voice in Romy's committee. They have committed quite strongly to influence their peers as well as to drive that broader conversation in a system way. So I think there's a couple of levels here. Universities are not a system. They work as individuals. TAFEs, we're probably better connected in some ways, but we still are state-based organisations. So getting that collaboration even amongst ourselves has been really useful. And then getting that collaboration across the tertiary education sector with all the other changes, the policy changes that are now driving us, this is a really, really important mature environment now to be able to engage with some of those proposed changes. If the investment hadn't been made, that has been made by Hess and right, as Barney said, right back to the declaration, to work together in a collaborative way, we wouldn't be able to get some of the early runs on the board. We will be able to get with the concept of harmonisation or the Australian Tertiary Education Commission. So I think that they're important. But I still think we're a long way from a system per se. And so although there have been some great collaborations, and there have been some really important movements forward, this environment provides an opportunity to move more into a tertiary education system by being able to demonstrate in a very practical way how to do that at the credentialing level. So you can have policy, but at the end of the day, you've got to be able to implement that policy. And this is one of the pragmatic places that you can actually implement that policy. So I think the TAFEs who've been part, and not all TAFEs yet are in the environment. We have 28 members, 6 of those are dual sector universities, so they're already there. And a large percentage of the others are there and on board, some more mature than others in the way, for example, Holmes Glen Institute, Canberra Institute of Technology, they've all been part of this for quite some time, TAFE SA, but others are still, and many of the other Victorian TAFEs, others are still coming to the realisation of the benefits this provides. So we will continue to work with MyEquals in that positive way to encourage that collaboration and to the formation of a tertiary education system.
If I could jump in on that, I mean, I agree with Jenny. I always agree with Jenny. It's a given. But I want to test this issue for a minute about collaboration, to be frank. I agree that we are not a system yet, but the reform agenda certainly wrapping around universities in this country about managed growth funding and having an Australian Tertiary Education Commission to steward the system, this important word about steward and stewardship, which is not to foster a highly competitive higher education system. That's not to say we don't have and shouldn't have healthy competition between institutions because they are trying to attract students. But in the context of managed growth and with the ATEC, we're certainly charged with the responsibility of encouraging a much higher level of collaboration as a characteristic of a system. And at the moment, we're finalising our statement of strategic priority for this interim first phase of mission-based compacts with universities. That statement of strategic priorities will include reference to a more joined up system, because we want universities to talk about what they're considering, their willingness to adopt a credit recognition framework that we'll be putting out, their interest in deepening connections with the vet sector, their deepening connections with TAFE, what that means, and the true nature of partnership. Jenny set up a meeting the other day. It was a fascinating conversation that I had with my fellow commissioners, with the leaders of our TAFE centres of excellence around Australia. Really fascinating conversation. And examples there of where great progress is being made in relationships with universities, but some hard yards to get there. So I think there's a lot of work we have to do, particularly when you see, in this case, TAFE at the heart of reform of vocational education and training, as this government has made very, very clear. TAFE Centres of Excellence are a hugely important initiative, but it will require relationships with universities. Now, it's something universities are not altogether used to. They're often at the centre rather than in that other partnership frame. Now, great to hear progress is being made, but we need to see that greater sense of collaboration. So the statement of strategic priorities will say, what are we doing? How can we help you in the context of a joined up tertiary education system? It'll also talk about collaboration as a priority, because we've already heard, even before the ATEC has released its mission-based compact template and guidelines and all the other important paraphernalia around this first wave of mission-based compacts for 2027. We've already seen universities doing interesting things. University of Canberra, CIT, really interesting. Western Sydney University and TAFE New South Wales, great. Southern Cross Uni, Griffith University announced some really great bulk block credit arrangements for TAFE diplomas. All of that ahead, in a sense, of us having an opportunity to begin the negotiation of mission-based compacts. Great to see that happening. But we've also had universities around Australia talking about different forms of collaboration. So I think, Jenny, that's what's exciting at the moment, that we have some interesting discussions where possibly some of the competitive tension, be interesting to see whether Romy's heard this yet in her engagement. I mean, South Australia, there's really interesting tertiary system evolving that we're very keen to see. TAFE South Australia, the new Adelaide University, and of course, Flinders doing great things. I just saw Flinders' new strategic plan, which is a pretty impressive and ambitious document in itself. But we are seeing just the beginnings of new models of collaboration being talked about, and I think that's to be encouraged. For example, the Northern Australian group of universities are having a conversation. Flinders does great things between South Australia and the Northern Territory. Charles Darwin University, James Cook, Central Queensland, and even the University of Western Australia, now interested in the Pilbara and the Kimberley region of Northwest and Western Australia. This is a great conversation to have, hugely important part of Australia. What can we do to better encourage collaboration? So, yes, it's not a system yet. No, we don't have as mature a level of collaboration as we want, but that's the role, I think, of the ATEC, working with TDA and others to foster and to showcase what's possible. And of course, the big question is, well, what can the ATEC do to help incentivise that? Well, the minister's made it clear that when it comes to credit recognition, there'll be additional load that he's asked the ATEC to consider allocating to universities to deepen those relationships. We have CSPs for TAFE, something that's dear to your heart, Jenny, I know, around Australia. Where's that going? What's the next phase of that? And how will that link to collaboration with universities? I think we're in a moment, come back to the zeitgeist a bit, where we've never had quite as much momentum building as we're having at the moment. I think we've got to find a way to harness all of that energy. And I think the ATEC, in its State of the System report this year and next year, every year it will produce it, and its State of the System, the obligation will be on the ATEC to ensure that it is able to demonstrate real, tangible, at-scale progress in collaboration. So I think there's a bit of a clarion call in all of that, Jenny, to move us forward. So you and I will have this conversation again with Future Campus. I'm sure of it. Tim's saying yes, possibly, where we'll discuss some of the success stories. And I've already attended some of the things that Flinders have been doing in degree apprenticeships. So, Romy, it's happening, isn't it? But can we build?
Yeah, it is. And I mean, maybe if I give you a couple of examples from Flinders, and don't get me wrong, they're still small scale and there's still a lot more. We've not got this nailed at all, but, you know, we need to look and do more. But, you know, we talk about credit management, and quite often we talk about it being at the pathway from, you know, TAFE to university, university to TAFE, which is important, of giving that really nice, clean, easy pathway for students to be able to transition through. But there's also the co-design and co-delivery. You know, we run a fashion design degree program that we actually deliver hand in hand with TAFE SA. You know, we teach part of it, they teach part of it, and, you know, it's a joint venture in order to deliver that. So there's those kind of ventures that are, you know, really important and add great value to what we do. And then lastly, the other example I'll share with you is one where it's more of an enabler. So we have a really great theatre programme at Flinders, and also TAFE SA run some different theatre programmes as well. Now, it's my understanding, I don't know whether it's this current situation, but at one point they didn't have enough people for the acting part of a programme at TAFE, but they had lots of people wanting to do the theatre management. We had people who were doing the acting programme. Guess what? If we're doing acting, why don't we allow the TAFE students to do the theatre management of it? So we weren't doing the same programs. We were just using the two programs to complement each other, to work together, to actually enable both of us being successful. So I think those are just like three different examples of how this work can take place. And I mean, if I was going to say anything that I think is the most important thing, is the principle has to be student first. You know, what is best for the student, for their learning experience? And if that's what's always front of mind for us, then we should make good progress. But yeah, small examples, I know, but just some examples to get us thinking about. And as I say, I appreciate we still have more work to do at Flinders as well as the sector wider.
Yeah, but I think that, you know, it's like most things, Romy, the accumulation of those small initiatives in terms of student numbers, but addressing a real need. I think the accumulation of those builds to a really nationally impressive opportunity. You mentioned fashion. Really interesting to mention fashion. The Australian Fashion Council announced their national manufacturing strategy just a week or so ago in Parliament House. The fashion industry in Australia, which is such an important part of Australia's economy, but yet the manufacturing side of fashion is under pressure. So we do need some really interesting innovation to ensure that pattern makers and sewing machinists and others continue to have an opportunity to learn in Australia and contribute to this extraordinary opportunity. Average age of people in the manufacturing side of fashion in Australia is just mind-bogglingly high, and we've got to do something about that. The other reason that I wanted to just mention, I've been very interested of late in some of our data coming through on what's happening in regional Australia. And I think regional study hubs and the metropolitan equivalent of regional study hubs and metro study hubs, I think are turning out to be an extraordinarily important way of encouraging people into tertiary education in our regions. Often TAFE does deliver in regions, but often it's private RTOs that do a lot of the heavy lifting in regional Australia. So we've got to realise the complexity of regional tertiary education delivery. But two things stand out when you look at the data on regional Australia. One is a very, very low tertiary participation rate, much lower than our metropolitan areas. And that's a challenge for us if we have that aspiration in mind to have 80% of the working age population with tertiary qualifications by 2050. So there's a responsibility on universities to reach deeply into regions. Our regional universities do a great job and in a sense are at the forefront of this. Regional study hubs, we've got to do better to uplift the tertiary participation rate. But there's a more troubling piece of data that I've been talking about a little on in the media of late, and that is those not in employment, education and training, the 15 to 24-year-olds that are NEET, not in employment, education and training. That is a worrying piece of data. 1 in 6 in regional Australia. 1 in 6. 1 in 10 in metropolitan Australia. So when we have this conversation around improving the collaboration and cohesiveness of our tertiary system, I think it's a great opportunity. However, it will fail unless we can encourage more young people to find their pathways through to tertiary education. And I know with the re-election of the Malinowskis government in South Australia, the Premier's been very committed to technical colleges in South Australia. And I think that is a hugely important initiative at scale to provide some young people, many young people, with an alternative pathway to tertiary education with a pre-employment, pre-apprenticeship, particularly high-quality work-like environment. I think we need to see that replicated right around Australia. We need to see vet and schools improving right around Australia as well, because I think we need to appreciate the challenge here around, I think I read this data right the other day, that it's only 59% of young people are attending more than 90% of the time at school. So we have some problems with school attendance, let alone with, I think average school attendance has now dropped below 90%. So we have a problem at school level. We have a problem with not in employment, education and training. We have some challenges around pathways, some really staggering data from the OECD last year about the career aspirations of 15-year-olds. I mention this so that we don't get lost in the opportunity at the tertiary level if we lose sight of outreach, engagement, encouragement, aspiration building in our schools and in our communities more broadly, because without that, we are going to struggle to get anywhere near those attainment targets. So I think it's a broader set of challenges, and I see great things happening, but let's not lose sight of just how significant they are.
And I think the tech colleges, Barney, is a really good example of things working together. I mean, it ticks a lot of boxes. It's not just metro-based. There are regional tech colleges that have been put in place. They even come with accommodation, recognising that students can't necessarily be there, day to day, and they'll come in and do more intensive kind of sessions. But each tech college has been set up with a partnership with TAFE, a partnership with a university, and a partnership with industries. So it's got the complete package. It's not just saying, okay, we're going to educate you in this way for the next 2 years. It's saying, we're going to educate you in this way. You're going to get tasters of these different elements. And then we're also going to help you into your next steps, whether that's directly into employment, whether it's to TAFE, whether it to be university. We're there actually giving you that pathway in. So I think it is a really strong example to look at. And I think it is worth using as a case study to help us.
Bearing in mind, Romy, they're a South Australian-based phenomenon predominantly. So, and I think it will be interesting to look at the longitudinal outcomes for those students as to whether we start to break down that notion, that old adage of parity of esteem, which is still alive and well in many, many contexts. So I think a case study in longitudinal outcomes for those students, because one would hope we have a TDA convention in first week of May in Brisbane, and we were doing some prep this week on the learn and earn model, and we had a couple of students that we were prepping with. And one of the comments from one of the students who's just completed her apprenticeship was, I went to school and she's done really well. Everyone thought I was academic. And as soon as I said I wanted to do an apprenticeship in plumbing, I was absolutely put down by my career people, by my school, etc. So I think that, this notion, and people might have read the Australian Financial Review on Wednesday, where there was a crazy piece of work from UK around that notion of, what will my neighbour think if my young people are actually going to move forward? We have not yet broken that understanding down at all. And one of the things I think that the whole notion of qualifications there's lots of conversations, and I'm not diminishing the importance of these in our micro-credentialing, short skilling sorts of environments, but qualifications, if they come from whichever pathway they come from, provide a real opportunity to go on, because they are the currency of investing in a future that takes you forward. And I do think for many of our young people, a first qualification in vocational education is often going to be for them a great stepping stone forward, whether it's on to a higher tertiary qualification or whether it spans out to more in vocational education, because that's just as legitimate and just as good in terms of what the country needs, including into picking up a whole lot of digital micro skills and capabilities to be able to perform as small business people or whatever the outcome ends up being. I just want to pick up on Romy's other point about co-design. We love that. That is all. If we could achieve more of that, the co-design, which isn't just you start here and you do this bit and then you go on to here, but the shared learning many years ago, and probably the regulatory environment has constrained it more, but many years ago, there was lots of co-design going on where students could move between doing some electives with TAFE for the university qualification, and the funding would be able to flow between them. We have to be able to move the shackles that prevent some of that happening, and some of those shackles sit in the regulatory environment. They're the big questions that will have to be asked going forward if we're to really move to a system that enables co-design and innovation and different ways of packaging up a qualification that really makes sense for an individual and for industry itself.
I'll jump in here with a quick question from the floor, because I think this also relates to perceptions and parity of esteem. The professional accreditation issues with the equalisation proposal. How can a vocational diploma or advanced diploma meet the requirements of Engineering Australia, for example, or other professional bodies you could substitute? How do you please the professional bodies in this whole discussion? How do you bring them on board?
Well, I think the professional associations and the accrediting bodies have a vital role to play. They also shouldn't be barriers to actually encouraging new types of credentials, new types of qualifications. I know our Jobs and Skills Councils, which are dealing with training package reform and workforce planning at an industry level, as well as stewardship of industry engagement in their particular sectors. They're looking at new ideas around vocational degrees, working with industry to say, well, do we really need this sort of structure at the moment for the sorts of emerging requirements on our mine sites or in our laboratories or wherever it might be? Perhaps there's a new type of degree that we need to explore. You need the accrediting bodies there to ensure it's fit for purpose, it gets the accreditation it needs in order to function in the profession. You certainly want qualifications that have industry pull in areas like engineering. So associate diplomas and diplomas have a role to play. It's really interesting in the IT space, if I use that as an interesting comparison, in New South Wales, where you have the Digital Accord in New South Wales, with tech companies, big tech companies committing to take on 20% of their workforce with VET qualifications, to really begin to recognise the importance of VET level quals, as much as people who might come through with an IT degree or a micro skill or whatever else. Absolutely, they have a role to play, but they also have to be willing to engage in innovation in relation to the way in which qualifications will emerge without putting the public at risk, right? I mean, if we're talking here in the health professions or in the engineering professions, they have appropriate standards for their degrees and for their graduates. All of that needs to be at play, but there are still huge opportunities for new types of credentialing, particularly where you are talking about upskilling and reskilling, because we are dealing with a transforming labour market, not just because it's being AI infused, but for a whole lot of other technological changes that are going on and demographic changes and other things. Net zero is an example of that. The strongly bifurcating Australian economy towards service industries. All of these things are driving the need for us to consider, how do we take transitioning parts of our workforce and ensure they have an ongoing opportunity. What skills and reskilling do they need in order to take the great experiences they've had working in coal-fired power generation and apply that in renewables in a net zero future or in a circular economy context? Pretty important things to do. So it's not so much about full-length qualification harmonisation. It's also about recognising we need to package our skills in a different way. One of the things people will hear more and more about in the future is the skills first movement around the world. Now, what that means is an observation that the OECD produced a report on this last year. Increasingly, if you look at recruitment ads, increasingly companies are looking for skills before qualifications and credentials. And increasingly with the influence of AI, they're looking for those human skills, the cognitive skills, the critical thinking skills, the problem solving skills, communication skills, the ability to, despite what some people say, the ability to work in groups is actually pretty important to business and industry. So in that context, we're seeing this incredible drive towards skills recognition. And that's so important. JSA is producing our national skills taxonomy at the moment, working with TAFE, working with universities, looking at credit recognition arrangements, but a broader range of use cases for a globally relevant national skills taxonomy, common language. Make sure we can identify the skills people have. And then when it comes to upskilling and reskilling, we can be more focused about it. A long answer because there's a lot to say about accrediting bodies. If you talk about the underutilization of migrants in this country, for example, and their skills, very topical at the moment. I think Martin Parkinson's giving an address at the National Press Club on this coming up. Great work from SSI on this as well. 600,000 migrants who are underutilised in the Australian labour market. And often it's because of very, very difficult recognition processes for prior learning in Australia. We have got to fix that. We've got to fix it with accrediting bodies and those registering people for particular occupations. It's absolutely vital. We've got to fix it. But it's also important for social cohesion in this country because too many people are being left behind because their skills are not being recognised. They don't have a sense of belonging in Australia as we want them to from migrant and refugee communities. So there's a social cohesion imperative and there is very much an economic imperative. And again, the accrediting bodies need to be engaged in this and appreciate the importance of rigorous change that's going to be needed for the qualifications of the future.
May, I think it also comes back to that word collaboration because as Barney said, there's a lot of emerging new things happening. And if you look at the vocational degrees as an example, and the Jobs and Skills Council for mining is pursuing a vocational degree in reliability engineering. So a vocational degree will be accredited by ASQA, but at the AQF level 7, in case everyone's not clear what that means. They have done a lot of industry consultation as to why there's a niche opportunity sitting there from an industry point of view. So that does mean that the professional associations will need to listen to some of that research. But then there might be another industry, and this is also happening through the TAFE Centres of Excellence, where when they've done the research, there isn't a case for something different than what's there. The case is there to make what we've got integrate better together and work better together. So I think it is an industry by industry proposition, and certainly it is about the whole notion of relationship building, collaboration, and those who are driving the innovation and pushing the innovation, making sure that those professional bodies are brought into the discussion early in the piece so they can see what industry is saying and why the changes are required.
Can I just jump in there, Jenny? Because do you think we talk about harmonisation in part because we don't really want to talk about how the choirs are singing out of tune for too long to many different audiences? I think you summed up earlier that there are limitations to how far we have come and that we have to go a lot further. Is one of the big challenges here to change major perceptions about HE versus vet and start to break down some of those old tropes that are there with many different people? And do we have the skills and resources to do that with the different audiences we need to convince?
So I think you've got a couple of questions in one there, Tim. From my point of view, I think there are some real policy limitations that we actually have to not dance around and actually tackle. And some of those policy limitations sit in the regulatory environment. Some of them, I mean, the regulators do what the regulators are required to do because of policy, but the policy construct of vocational education that is sitting in a training package as the predominant means through which vocational education and training is delivered, that needs to really be challenged as to its agility, in particular at the higher levels of the AQF for where vet sits outside the licensing trades. That has to be challenged because it can't possibly, that process, you know, the advent of AI, for example, and we will have an AI conversation at our TDA convention 2026, the training packages can't possibly keep up with some of that, and yet our staff are having to adjust already. So I think that there are some policy restrictions that cannot be danced around if we're to really look at this conversation. But your second question does come back to this notion of how we perceive vocational education and training and higher education. And I mean, I just thought, and with respect, Romy, Australia is a much better place than the UK when I read that article in the AFR on Wednesday, which really said a lot. You know, the class system was still well in place. That vocational education and training was not perceived, if that's what your young person made a decision to do. And the article, I can't remember the beginning of it, but the back end was, and the title, "What Will the Neighbours Say?" I mean, you know, that I don't think we have that in Australia, and I think there is a growing understanding of that there are many opportunities. I do believe we are not good at enabling through schools, and I think this is a big piece and body of work that Barney alluded to at the start of this that needs to be thought through a lot more, because every school teacher is university qualified, and very, very few school teachers are vocational education qualified in the first instance. So there's a lot that needs to happen there. But I think it's two things, Tim. I think there's restrictions around policy, funding, and don't forget the funding bit. You know, vet is not funded at the same level as higher education, and regulatory environment. And then there is this notion that sits around what is, you know, what is vocational education, what is higher education, and you know, many of us will have had conversations with our own peers when their young people make vocational pathway decisions, and their parents may not come from a vocational background. You know, it's still very easy, much easier to walk into vocational education. To quote the electrical union, if your father, brother, or in-law were in that industry, it's easier to break in than if they don't. And it's not only easier to break in, it's also easier to get the acceptance from the people, your parental body and your other wider circles, that that's a good pathway. That we've been fighting for so long, and I think there are incremental changes in that environment, but they're still incremental to some extent.
Can I pick this up, though? I think I had an example of the distance we have to travel on this recently with a particular journalist who wrote a story on tertiary harmonisation, interviewed me, and it was you know, the nature of the pressure that journalists are under now, that they use AI, they use transcription, they use AI to help them get a story done quickly to try and get it up. And AI had taken parody of esteem and made it a parody of esteem. And no sub-editor had picked it up. And I read the article and said, well, it's definitely not a parody of esteem. And I rang up the journalist and said, you've got to change the online version. It's a very different context when what we're doing with esteem is parodying it as opposed to encouraging the equality of the two in the context of possible career paths for young people. So we still have a distance to travel. I don't think, though, Tim, this is because we're trying to avoid those challenges. I think we acknowledge them. I think part of my role as Jobs and Skills Australia Commissioner is to stand up and talk about this. I did it at my first press club address as a JSA Commissioner and make it pretty clear that from a personal perspective as well as a professional one, I think Australia needs to embrace the equivalence of our two extraordinarily important parts of tertiary education and hopefully make them work better together. And it is an international phenomenon. I often quote David Brooks, his article in the Atlantic Monthly last year, an 11,000-word piece, which was essentially addressing this issue in the context of the US after 25 years of bipartisan support in the US from Presidents Clinton and Bush onwards to encourage young people into college-level education. It has gutted the technical class in the United States to an extent that it is causing serious challenges to their economy. And he gives extraordinary examples in that of one university in the United States and its annual graduating class of journalists exceeds the entire demand for journalists in the United States. And that's one school generating it. And the debt levels are enormous. So having a conversation around this is really important. And I agree with Jenny, we should not shy away from that conversation, nor the conversation about funding mechanisms, because often the differential in the way in which VET, TAFE and higher ed are funded means it's a barrier to encouraging really deep collaboration. Now, we need to get over that. We need to work it through. That's a matter for government, but it's a reality. And when you look at the work the Tertiary System Advisory Council will do, and Jenny is a part of that, it will discuss a whole range of reforms we need to take forward, of which funding will appear. So let's not shy away from any of it.
I've not got much to add because Jenny and Barney have both given wonderful answers. But I mean, I think Jenny was touching on it. You know, really, the schools should be part of this conversation as well. It's not just a conversation by the time people are, you know, getting to the higher education part. It's actually part of the school system of actually helping people understand that there's lots of great education out of there. It's fit for purpose, and there's not one better than the other. It's just what are you wanting to do and who is the best provider for that, you know, and making that choice. And the more that we get that understood in the school system, the more confidence people will have in making their choices, and that transition from one to the other as well, that's just, you know, good decision making for the learner as they go along. So I think that's an interesting thing to think about where we are with schools in that kind of thinking and conversation.
I mean, I make it clear when people talk about this that we need to remember that the pathways are there. One of the great things about Australia's tertiary education system is that you can navigate through it. It's not necessarily as easy as it should be, but you can. And no one should feel that a choice they make as a 17 or an 18-year-old somehow defines them for a life. It doesn't. There are many opportunities and great examples of people who move from one system to the other. Interesting stat I heard the other day about apprentices in New Zealand and how many of them have the equivalent of a HECS debt because they've gone to university and now they're going to do their apprenticeship. They tend to be older apprentices in New Zealand, and I think like 30% of them have HECS debt. In Australia, I think it's about 10% of our apprentices actually have a certain amount of help debt. So we need to really reinforce to young people that this is not a once-in-a-lifetime choice. You know, the non-linearity of careers in the future is going to define them. Lifelong learning is going to be crucial. Micro-learning as much as workplace learning. And I think Shirley's comment in the Q&A is a really interesting one about the cyclical, multidimensional nature of this. So we need to not discourage people from exploring their pathways. What we need to do is to make this as seamless as possible. No barriers, no restrictions, no inertia, because wherever you're moving, whether you've done a degree and you want to get the vocational skills you need for the future, and with platforms like MyEquals and platforms based around MyEquals, that'll actually give us this capacity for precedent-based assessment of credit moving towards much easier block credit arrangements, and to make it easy for a student to go into a system and say, right, I've done this, I want to do that. What's the easiest and simplest way of doing it? And I like what's happening as an example in New South Wales, where Western Sydney and TAFE New South Wales are block crediting through free TAFE programs for equity students in diplomas, block credited into degree programs, and they get an offer for the entirety of that opportunity when they enrol, even if they exit with the diploma. So I think we need seamlessness and to remove any of that inertia. But actually, there's a platform solution here that we're crying out for. And the other point I wanted to make about platform solutions, universities are under a lot of pressure for a whole raft of reasons. The ATEC will be distributing additional managed growth funding in the future, which I'm very confident will help universities to navigate successfully in a very sustainable way into the future. However, I think universities are going to need to think about different ways of collaborating, not just about teaching and learning and tertiary harmonisation, but between themselves to make them as efficient as possible so they can maximally invest in teaching and research in the Australian national interest. And again, we're going to need that sort of technical-based support around that to make it as easy as possible. I've been involved in higher ed far too long. Many people tell me that, far too long. But thank you, Romy. Jenny was going like that. Yes, Barney, that's true. You were going, no, Barney. But interesting reflection. But I know many times we've had these conversations in the sector about back office harmonisation. You know, what can we do to get our finance, our IT, HR, all of these things? We all duplicate incredible services. How can we do that better to give a better student experience and to give staff a better experience and to take away some of the challenges, because not every university can deliver services at the same level. That's another really important part of the way in which we need to collaborate and the systems we need. I think My Equals has been such a great example of what the sector can do, alongside some of the other great success stories. ARNet, for example, the way we collaborate together to have a research academic network that connects us around the world and supports the South Pacific and everywhere else. Incredible success story. UniSuper, UniMutual, IDP. These have been great success stories of higher education and the entrepreneurial nature of higher education in Australia. I don't think we should lose sight of that in the next wave as we get universities to really start thinking. And I think some of these conversations are going on. We need to encourage them.
I love your passion for systems, Barney. I think only you could project such passion over a systems discussion to make it interesting. So thank you for that. But I mean, as all of us would say, it's clearly true what you're saying. If you can get internal harmonisation as well as skills-based, I realise we're running a little bit short of time. I'm really interested in each of your thoughts quite quickly on just one specific thing which has come across. Shirley raised the point of lifelong learning and the importance of credit recognition, not just through study, but also into the workforce. We've talked a little bit about that. Where to from here with My Equals and our future as workers?
Who do you want to go first, Tim?
I can certainly say something, certainly just quickly in terms of just thinking about the credit management initiative. We've recognised that recognition of experience and how that is then factored in is a critical component, and so needs to be able to be supported as part of any sort of systems-based approach, because as you said, it's becoming more and more critical. That porous nature of the programs of learning, that lifelong learning, from what everybody was saying, particularly about from school, and making it clear, the HSC or VC, that doesn't set your life. You're going to be studying for the rest of your life, and we need to be able to move between sectors and jobs quickly. And so we need to be able to reflect not only, if you like, those academic outcomes, but also those critical life and other related skills that, as we continue to hear, are equally, if not becoming even more important to employers. So any solution needs to be able to reflect that as well.
I might jump in quickly if I might. Sorry, Barney. I kind of think about three things. Traditionally, you've seen the higher education sector as being a pathway, then moving into the workforce. It is always going to have a place there, but I think there's a lot more to it. I think Barney mentioned the degree apprenticeships that we've been, a few universities taken on. It's actually putting people in the workforce whilst they're having their education is a really important part, and that workforce development. Also, alongside that of looking at workforce development, organisations quite often know what they need, and it's not necessarily our degree programs exactly as they are, so us working together with industry to customize programs that are what they need for their workforce, so that more B2B kind of way of thinking. And then I think lastly, we know that graduates, even if they do go in a job for a length of time, it's going to change, so they need that ongoing professional development. But also a lot of people will change jobs, change careers. So how do we help people transition? So yeah, they may be an engineer, but are they the type of engineer who could work in the defence industry? What do we have to do to help them with that transition? So those are my thoughts about what we need to be thinking about as educators.
Look,
I'll just have one bit of a provocative statement, because I think this is a future thing, Tim. I think it's a term that resonates with people who work in academic organisations and doesn't work that well outside. And I think we need to have a think about that, because it sounds a bit daunting to have to learn for life, even though that's what every single one of us around this table will have been doing all over our career. So I'll leave my comments there.
Look, I'll pick that up and say JSA is going to produce some reports this year on lifelong learning. So look out for those. I think it'll start to put perhaps a sharper point on what Jenny's saying, and to start to explain and contextualise it a little bit in the Australian context. So look forward to that.
This has been just an exceptional discussion. I think we're pretty much out of time. Thank you each for your time and contributions. I know there'll be a lot of interest in watching this back and in others. So Jenny, Romy, Barney, and Anthony, thanks very much.